Hey, Aharon Rabinowitz here for thepixellab.net. When Epic Games released Unreal Engine version 5.3, they included native support for VDB sequences, making it possible to add pre-animated volumes like fire or smoke. But with very little documentation and a complex workflow, it's been kind of hard to use. But in this video, I'll show you how to use this free, flexible, advanced shader for VDBs that I built, which is going to make it super easy for you to add volume-based visual effects into your work. I'll be using VDBs from the Pixel Lab's huge library of visual effects, but this shader works with volumes from anywhere. Special thanks to Jonathan Winbush for compiling much of this information in different tutorials, and if you want to learn things about Cinema 4D and Unreal, he is the man to follow. Check out his channel on YouTube and get ready to have your mind blown. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to create a project, and if you haven't already turned on ray tracing, just go up into the project settings, so edit project settings, and make sure that you turn on two things. So you'll start typing in ray space tracing, and before you even finish, some properties will come up. And you want to turn on support hardware ray tracing, that should be on, and then also path tracing right here. You want to turn that on if you plan to use path tracing. Okay, closing that out. So now let's get started. The first thing you're going to need to do is copy the files over for the shader into your project. To do that, you'll download the files, and once you've downloaded and unzipped them, you'll see that there's a Pixel Lab VDB folder, and inside of that, there's a content folder. And inside of that, there's a Pixel Lab _VDB _shader folder. And this is what you're going to do. You're just going to copy this. So, you can choose right click and choose copy, or, drag it. But either way, we're going to go over to the content of the project file that we're using right now in this folder. And I'm just going to hit paste. And it's going to copy the files over. And we can see that my project file now has the Pixel Lab VDB shader set up in there. At this point, you might need to restart to get it to see the shaders properly, but after you do that, everything should be fine. So now that we've done this, you can see we have a folder that's been added to our project, and if we go inside of this Pixel Lab VDB shader folder, you'll see that there's a VDB Material instance, and then a folder called Source Files, which you want to leave this alone. So we'll just go up one level, and this is the file that we're going to be most working with here. In the meantime, I'm going to go back to the content folder, and I'm going to grab hold of this VDB sequence from the pixellab.net. I'm going to drag the first frame right into Unreal here. And once I do that, you can see that this dialog for Open VDB import options appears. And this is where we need to make a couple of changes. And it's found a sequence of 130 files, so we're going to say yes, it's going to be checked off. And then there's attributes A, and we've got this thing that says 8-bit, and then there's 32-bit and 16-bit. Now, this stuff is not well documented, but my guess is that this is about the color maps that control density and temperature, and the larger the number, the more data that will be in there. For now, I'm just going to leave it at 8-bit, but you can change it to 16 or 32. And then I'm going to come over to the second area right here, and I'm going to set this to temperature. If there were a third option, you could put it over here, but right now there's only two in this one. In fact, if you were to import something like a VDB cloud, which doesn't have any heat, no fire, anything like that, then you'll probably only see a density channel and not a temperature channel. I'm also just going to get rid of what's here. We don't need this. Then I'm going to click Import. And it starts the importing of the VDB. It can take a minute or two. And once that's done, you can see that the VDB has been imported right here. With that done, I'm going to jump back into the VDB shader folder, and I'm going to drag and copy this. Just choose copy here. And we've got this VDB material instance. And I just do that so that I don't mess with the original materials. Now I've got a copy that I can work with. Then up here in the Place Actors panel, and you can find that by going to Window, Place Actors. Once I'm there, I'm going to type in and before I can even finish writing heterogeneous volume, I'm just going to drag this and drop it right here. And then I'm going to take this material and I'm going to drag it right onto the materials for that volume. And you can see that it's got a single frame right here of an explosion. It's not looking too good. Let's just get in a little tighter there because it's sideways. So I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees. And I'm going to bring it up right here like this. Doesn't really matter too much. And this still frame is just here to help you see what things should look like. Okay, now let's take a look at how all of this works. I'm going to double click on the material to open it. And when I get inside, I'm going to see a whole bunch of parameters. The first one is this one called VDB file. And when I check it on, it allows me to change the VDB source file. So I'm just going to grab the one that is the one we brought in, this animated sparse volume texture. And we're not going to see anything at first because the first frame of this animation doesn't really have anything in it. So what I need to do is to come down over to here and I can turn on playing and looping, which will make the animation play and loop and helps me to position things a little bit better maybe and kind of get it to where I can see it sitting on the floor properly. And that looks cool, but I'm going to stop the playing and the looping, and instead I'm just going to go to a frame of the animation where I've got some nice explosion stuff happening, where I've got a nice mix of the heat and also the smoke. And this looks like a good frame at which to do it. So let's frame 30, we'll leave it at that. And then I'm going to go back into the material. And once we look over here, we can see we've got different properties, and one of them is density. Density controls, in this case, the thickness of the smoke. So I could lower this down to something closer to like 0.4, and you can see more of the heat is showing through. If I bring this all the way down, then we'll only see the heat and only see that fiery part. But if I bring it back to something like 0.8, that's a pretty good place to be. Although in this case, I think actually 1 is a good place for this particular animation. So I'll leave that as it is. And then we'll take a look at temperature. Now, temperature controls how hot is this whole VDB. Essentially, there's a channel that came in with it from the program that made this VDB that said that there is heat in it. And if we lower this temperature down to nothing, then we have no heat. If we bring it up really high, it gets very, very hot. Now, I'd like to reset this back to the 3000 that it was at, and I could try hitting this right here, but I've noticed this kind of a bug. And the bug is that when you change the numbers using things like reset, they just don't update here in the visuals. So what I'd say is just bring it by hand, type in 3000 for now, and maybe this is a bug that Unreal will fix, but for now, this is the bug. The next thing to do is to look at the temperature emissive strength. Now, whereas the temperature tells me how hot this is, the temperature emissive strength tells me how bright that temperature emissive is. So like if I combine this down to something really small, but I crank up the emissive, we're going to see only in those areas that are considered hot, that's where we're going to see that glow. If I crank up this number higher, we're going to see this emissive really starting to fill up and make the rest of this glow. So it's really a combination of these two, one that tells me how hot it is and one that tells me how bright it is. I'm going to set this back to 3000. And I'm going to set this one back to 1, which is our emissive strength, and then we'll take a look at the next section. Now below our main controls, we've got our color controls, and you'll see first we have our scatter and smoke color. The first option here is called Use VDB Scatter Color. This is meant for a VDB that actually has color information in the scatter color, in the smoke. And in this particular case, we don't have that. So if I were to turn this on, I think that it's pulling it from the temperature colors, but it's not appropriate to use here. So let me turn that off, and we'll come back to that for an example that makes sense a little later. Now, in this case, I'm going to work with the scatter color. By default, the scatter colors are set to 50% gray, and that's actually a great place for smoke. But if you wanted to give it a little more life and have it kind of change over time, where we make the first color white, and I'm just going to click OK, and then I'm going to make the second color black, and we definitely get a more interesting defined look. And that's cool, but you can also do things with colors. So I could say the first color would be blue, and the second color will be purple. And then we get something that looks, again, very interesting, although maybe not the best look, but it's definitely a way for you to art direct this smoke a little bit. And if we minimize here and we animate this over time, we can see that what's actually happening is it's transitioning from one color to the other as the smoke ages. So the first color, that pink, is brighter, and then it kind of transitions into that darker blue color. And I'm just going to bring it back to something like right here. And if I go back into the material, you can also see that we have this scatter color bias. So I can push the colors more towards one or the other over time, right? So if I set it to, let's say 0.5, then the purple will last less time in that smoke animation. If I set it up to 2, then the purple will last a lot longer, and the blue is going to be the part that gets seen barely at all. In any case, I just want to reset this back to 50% gray, and it's a great time to just remind you there's this bug, and if I click on it, nothing happens. I've got to go in here, and what I find is if I do this and this, and click OK, that will work. And if I, again, come in here, I can just copy this color right here, and we're back, and we're good. And I'm going to set the scatter color bias back to 1, although in this case, now that it's the same color, it doesn't really matter. Now, below our scatter and smoke colors, we have our emissive colors. And this is where we can change how the glowing part looks. So we've got our use black body color by default, and that's just pulling from the temperature. So you get like from orange all the way up to yellow, and that creates a fiery look. If we turn this off, then what we get instead are a couple of different options. Now, this first one called Emissive Color from Scatter, we're not going to touch here really, because if we turn it on, it's just going to be pulling these two colors, and we don't actually want to do that. This is not a great place to use that, so let's just turn that off. Instead, let's look at the cool color and the hot color. And basically, the outermost parts of the heat are going to be this cooler temperature. And so we're going to see that as dark blue, and the hottest areas are going to be this bright blue. And if I were to change this color to, let's say, purple, for example, for the outer color, and I maybe change the inner color to green, it looks pretty interesting, although maybe not beautiful, but you can see that we can control the colors of the emissive channel. I'm going to lower the density quite a bit here just so we can start seeing a little more inside. And you'll see that we can also push the colors more towards the hot or the cold color like we did before. So I can bring up the bias, and that will bring me towards the hot color. If I bring it down to 0.5, that brings me down to the low color with just a little bit of green. And as I lower the temperature, what we'll see is that we're just seeing more of that purple where we should see in the hot points that green. So here, let me just bring this up a bit, and you can see as we go back up, those hot points are going to be green. Now let me just bring all of this back to where it should be. And finally, we've got this emissive remap adjustments area. It's kind of like the levels effect in Photoshop in that it lets you expand or compress the bright and darker areas. So let me just bring everything back to their default here. And if I come into my input low and my input high, I can bring up the input low, and that'll strengthen the lowest point, and we'll end up getting less brighter areas. And I can also bring down this input high, and we end up with brighter areas, but they're sort of more compressed as to where they are. Or I can bring this back to the original numbers. I can work with the target low and target high. I can lower down this number, and you can see that we never really get too hot, but I can also just strengthen it so that more of it has temperature in it, more of it has heat. It's just never getting too hot because it never goes above this number. You're probably not going to use it too much, but it's there for you if you need it. By the way, like I mentioned earlier, this shader does work with VDBs from anywhere. And in this case, I'm using one from Cinema 4D. What you'll see is that it doesn't have quite the brightness that the ones we're using from Pixel Lab have, and that's because Cinema 4D's temperature default is something like 6500. And when we do that, we get something that looks a little more like what we'll see inside of Cinema 4D. So this shader is going to work with any VDBs you have. And just to come full circle, because we talked earlier about some VDBs not having a temperature channel like a cloud, and in this case you can see if I raise the temperature no matter how high I make it or no matter how low I make it, you can see that it doesn't affect the image. So I can, again, bring up the emissive values, bring up the temperature, nothing happens. However, if I come into the scatter colors, the smoke, we can change the colors here because these parameters are part of the channels that were included with the cloud VDB. So some of these controls may not work as expected if you're bringing in something that doesn't have a channel that they can affect, like the temperature. Now, earlier I mentioned that we were going to look at this one property here called Use VDB Scatter Color. And this property is for a VDB that actually has a color channel. So let's look at one that has that. Pixel Lab has a bunch of VDBs called the nebulas, and they're part of a package that you can get that have different colors within the nebula. And if I were to drag this in, let's just bring it in here, and then we can see that we've got the red, green, and blue channels all have these different color channels, and then we've got the density and the alpha. I'm going to click on Import, and it'll take care of that. And once that's imported, I can just drag this right here into this property over here, and we can see that we've got a nebula, and it's using right now what appears to be the emissive color. So let me just do a few things here. I'm going to lower down the emissive all the way down to 0 so that we don't see any of that. And now we've just got this, what looks like a cloud, essentially. But if I were to tell it to take its color from the VDB itself, now we start seeing something where we've got the color that's the blue and the orange that are in this VDB. And then if I come back to the emissive channel, instead of using the black body color, I can tell it to use the emissive color from the scatter. And over here, back on temperature, I'm going to set the emissive strength back to 1. And now I've got a nebula that is both using its color for the cloudy parts and also the emissives as the same source, which is the colors that came with it. And, you could do things like lowering the density a little bit and then just get less of the dense cloud stuff and more of the glowy stuff. And you'll have to play around with that to get to results that you want. In fact, in a situation where I've turned off all the lights, I've brought the density down to 0, I have a lower temperature of just 1,000 and a temperature emissive strength of just 1, as I move through it, I can really get a nice nebula effect here just by moving through it. It's really cool. Now, what if you wanted to use VDBs with the path tracer? The path tracer is a high quality renderer that comes with Unreal. It takes longer to render stuff out of it, but it looks a lot better. You get better reflections, better lighting, all sorts of good stuff. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to go from lit over here, right over to path tracing, and immediately I can see that my VDB has disappeared. My volume is no longer visible. So we have to tell the path tracer to render the VDB. To do that, I'm just going to go into this command area right here, and I'm going to type r.pathtracing.het, and from the options you'll see two things, and the first one is called heterogeneous volumes, and we're going to click on that, and then we're going to hit space, and we're going to add 1. And 1 is to turn it on, and if we wanted to turn it off, we would type in 0, we hit 1, we hit enter, and now we can see this. And first of all, we can see we're getting a shadow right here, which we weren't getting before. And we can also really increase the temperature and the emissiveness, right? So let's get this up real high. And if we do this, I'm gonna go crazy here. I'm gonna go full nuts. You can see that the lighting is now on the floor as well. Not only do we get this shadows, we also get this lighting. And, you know, let me just bring this back to 1. We might want to lower the colors here from gray to closer to black, which I think might look better. And it's important to note because of that stuff in the path tracer does tend to look different than it does in the standard renderer. So anyway, you can see this looks pretty cool, and that's how you use VDBs with the path tracer. Now, what if we want to drop this in the sequencer and have it explode at a particular point in time? So let's take a look at that. I'm going to add in a new level sequence, and we'll just keep the name new level sequence, save it. And then I'm going to take the volume here, and I'm going to drop it right in here. Then I'm going to click on the plus button, and I'm going to choose heterogeneous volume component. And from here, I'm going to click on this right here, and I'm going to look at the different options for animation. I've tried a few different ways, and it seems to me like the best way is to use the frame to trigger the animation. So I'm going to set it to frame. And I'm going to set this frame to frame 0. I'm on the first frame, which is 0. I'm going to set a keyframe. I've also turned this on so that if I make any changes to the value, that will be automatically set as a keyframe. I'm going to move down to frame 129 because I know there's 130 frames and the first one is 0 and the last one is 129. And I'm going to set this to 129. And now if I hit play, well, I'm going to see something weird. It kind of ramps up really slowly and then picks up speed. And why is that? Because these are ease keyframes. So we're just going to select them and right click, and from the options, which you might not be able to see on your screen, linear right here, it's the triangle shape option. You've got cubic, you've got constant. I'm going to go with linear. And by choosing linear, I've made sure that it moves in a linear fashion where it doesn't ramp up over time. So now if we hit play, you can see that we've got that. So far, so good. Now, if I wanted this to start maybe 15 frames down, I could just move this whole thing like this. And it looks good. The problem is this, I just realized that if we bring this up a little further, right, we can see that the first frame has got this little dot right there. So look at that. So we don't want that. We don't want that little dot there. And there's definitely a couple of ways you can handle this. To me, what seems like the best way in this particular case is I'm going to go back to this frame 0 now. And I'm going to set this to frame 129, right? Because frame 129 has nothing in it, right? The volume's dissipated. And the problem is that if we play back from 129 down to 0, it kind of runs backwards, which is not what I want. So I'm going to select this keyframe right here, and I'm going to right click. And instead of using the linear, which again, you can't see, I'm going to choose constant, which is a square. And then from there, it will hold frame 129 and then jump to frame 0. There we are. And something that I probably should have thought about ahead of time is the frame rate. I can set the frame rate here to a different frame rate, but if I set it to 24 frames per second right now, well, you can see that the frames are no longer matching up to where they were. And so we probably should have done that ahead. Now we have to calculate the distance between this one right here, 12. We have to add in 129, and that would be 141. So I've really got to move down further in time to something like 141. So let me just get myself to 141 here, and I can either grab this keyframe and drag it to there, or I could, drag out these edges right there. But that gets me there. This looks right now. Anyway, that's it, and I hope that this helps you in your work. If you're doing a lot of stuff in Unreal, then check out the products at pixellab.net for Unreal, and you'll see that they've got tons of Alembic and VDB files. Plus, if you need materials for motion graphics, check out the new Unreal Materials for Motion Graphics. It's packed with literally hundreds of materials for high-end motion design and visual effects, stuff like metals and glass and animated neons and much more. I think you really like it. Once again, I'm Aharon Rabinowitz for the pixellab.net, and I'll see you soon.